This week, Zach Wasserman, CTO and co-founder of Fleet, joins us to discuss open source endpoint security with Osquery and Fleet. Then, the triumphant return of Sven Morgenroth, security researcher for Invicti, will be giving a technical segment on hacking GraphQL. In the security news, following the ransomware money, the mystery snail, school cybersecurity is the law. Sue anyone, just not security researchers, hacking a flight school, refusing bug bounties in favor of disclosure, Apple still treats researchers like dog poo, prosecuting people for reading HTML, giving up on security, and a high school prank that never wants to give you up and won't let you down. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Cybersecurity is about more than just technology. It's about how people behave with emails, data, and cloud applications that directly impacts your company's security posture. Security works best when it's ingrained in the culture of your organization. To learn how to build a security culture and transform your employees from targets into a strong line of defense, head to securityweekly.com/proofpoint and visit their Cybersecurity Awareness Center.
Hey, and welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man who doesn't like when ghosts come to his house for trick-or-treating. Why? They smell like sheet. Mr. Paul Asadorian!
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 714, recorded on October 14th, 2021, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. Mr. Larry Pesce is to my left. Larry, welcome.
How's it going?
You approved of my soldering.
I did, yeah.
Incapabilities, I guess you could call them.
Let's put it this way: with some practice, it'll be amazing.
Right.
You're pretty good.
That's just what it is with soldering, right? You just got to do it.
It's all practice. It's all practice, and having a little bit of the technique is like if you had somebody to show you how to do it.
Right. I had YouTube. That's what I ended up with.
If you had me to show you how to do it,
we'll have to schedule a soldering because I have lots of little other kits. That need to be put together. So maybe next time. That'll be greatly appreciated.
Do
it
on
Tyler,
the show.
Yeah, we'll do it live.
Hey.
Josh Marpet's here with us. Josh, welcome.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
But I mean, that was like, can you imagine the two of you, with Larry gently holding your shoulder so that you can solder properly in the proper form?
Proper form.
It'd be like Ghost.
Except cooler. Let's be clear.
Yep.
Much, much cooler.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a request from the listeners to have live on the air us fixing our Drobo NAS, which is what this soldering project was. So,
man, we should have Twitch streamed that. Isn't that what all
I think we'll find some other stuff to Twitch stream that involves soldering, and Larry can give me a lesson live on the air. That'd be awesome.
Oh yeah.
Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Buenos noches. It's not always ideal to solder at 800 degrees, but you got it done. You heated it up hot enough to
Well, that
stuff
was,
something.
I didn't have all the right tools, so when I was desoldering, I had to really crank the heat because I didn't have Larry described for me all of the proper tools. That sounded way easier than the way I was doing. All I had was a soldering iron, so, got it to work.
Lord.
Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here, but like my buddy who's addicted to collecting vintage Beatles albums, I need help.
There's a new Beatles documentary coming out. Did you guys? Intern Dylan was just telling me about that. Yeah.
Is it really?
Yeah. He said there's something like 57 hours from a Let It Be recording that they found that kind of led to the documentary. Sounds interesting. I like documentaries. Let's see. We know we have some a quick announcement. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through the 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. Keynotes from Melissa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy, as well as many other fabulous presenters. You can visit securityweekly.com/unlock to register and check out the Rockstar lineup. Joining us for this segment is Zach Wasserman, the CTO and co-founder of Fleet. Zach joins us to walk us through using Osquery and Fleet to enable observation, collection, and investigation on endpoints. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's good to be here.
Nice to have you here, Zach. How did I'm curious. How did you get your start in information security, or is that your background, or like what got you started in a field of technology, or maybe not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I got started. I was studying computer science in university, and I met a grad student who'd got involved with the research of Matt Blaze, who you may have heard of. He's done some interesting work on election machine integrity and stuff. And they said, why don't you come join us? We're going to break the radios that the FBI is switching to. So I ended up getting to work with those folks, building some software and looking into the protocols that the feds are all using now. And we recorded some conversations that probably weren't supposed to be in the clear, but were. And I got a taste of learning how to, evaluate systems, break them, and see where the boundaries are.
Wait, Zach, how do I not know you? Have we met? Seriously, like I was there when Matt and Mouse were working on the PR25 stuff, and
the Project 25 paper, why Johnny still can't encrypt. So I was like their undergrad research assistant.
Oh no shit,
that's awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so I was at the lab with them. I mean, not like all the time. I visited a couple times with Bill and Mouse and Matt and everybody, and I don't remember meeting. I might have met you. I apologize.
We may have met at the time. It's damn near 10 years ago now, and I'm a bit older. I would have been just a child then.
And was Q Andrew Q Ryder involved in that too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Q was there. Yep. Yeah. Travis Goodspeed, Sandy Clark, Perry Metzger.
Yep.
I mean, if I had to secure radio communications, that's a lineup I would want to have on my team for sure.
Yeah.
So, Zach, did you work for Facebook? Is that?
I did. Yeah. So then, the next thing that happened was I graduated from university. I started working at Facebook and ended up on the security team there, which was like the opportunity to kind of marry my interests of the security side of things with the getting to the massive scale, which I mean at the time was like hundreds of thousands of devices that Facebook was managing, and now it has grown into millions and millions of servers sitting in those data centers. So I was at Facebook in 2014 when Mike Arpaia joined, and he had the vision for Osquery. And basically, Mike started building it and tapped me to do some of the reviews of the earliest code and design documents. And, the story goes from there pretty much.
That's amazing. And so when you were first working on Osquery, was it a closed-sourced project?
The intention was the whole time that we were going to open source Osquery. So, I mean, folks who've worked on open source software before, and especially open sourcing software that didn't start with that intention, know that there's like a lot of work to get something to a level of maturity and understandability for like the general public to consume.
Right.
Luckily, we had the buy-in from the management at that time, and Mike had the vision that this had to be a tool that everyone could use. So we built it from the ground up with the intent that it'd be open source. I think it took about 6 months to get to the first open source release, but that had been the plan all along.
It's amazing. What was the benefit to Facebook to basically fund this open source project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially at the time, Facebook was really buying into that hacker culture of open source and saw it as a great way to help improve the security posture of folks all throughout the industry and to help recruit for their security team and build up their reputation. And I think, most of all, we as individuals believe that everyone would benefit the most from the tool being open, and that Facebook as well would benefit from the stability, from the testing, from users out there in the wild and their contributions and their ideas.
I'm curious, Zach, what was it like working at Facebook? This is probably at a time before pre-pandemic, right? When you would go into the office?
Yeah, this is about 2014, 2015. So I was relatively freshly out of university, and it was kind of like a university campus. There's like a free candy shop folks would come visit and be like, okay, let's go get some ice cream, and I can show you the arcade. It gives people a funny view of what they think you do for work. The reality is, no matter where you are in the tech industry, you're almost always just sitting in front of that computer all day. But it was certainly an interesting environment to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when you were at Facebook, so how did Facebook, like, they open sourced it? Did they kind of like divest the development of it? Like, how does the story continue to unfold?
Yeah, for sure. So Facebook really invested really heavily in Osquery over those first years after we, envisioned it and released it. At first, it was targeting only Mac and Linux platforms, which is really based on that we'd identified this need where Windows was covered pretty well by some of the existing commercial endpoint security tools, and Mac had almost nothing, and Linux similarly almost nothing. So we got it out initially with the Mac and Linux support. Facebook brought on Trail of Bits, a consulting firm that folks might be familiar with, to add that initial Windows support somewhere around like year 2 or 3 of the project. And Facebook really invested heavily in it for a long time. Folks like Ted Reed at Facebook just did some amazing work with Osquery that I think really helped bring it to a lot more organizations. And then I think it was around 2019 that Facebook handed the project over to the Linux Foundation. So it's been a kind of independently run project under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation since 2019, and now it's kind of governed by a board of folks who are at places like Facebook, Google, myself, and Trail of Bits.
Zach, it'd be remiss to not mention the elephant in the room, where Facebook gets some bad press, and certainly, privacy is a thing, and I think a lot of people feel like Facebook does not treat people's privacy the way they should. Did it seem weird to you that they were doing this awesome thing for the community, but then there's Cambridge Analytica and all this other stuff going on, which was unfolding around the time that you were there and making this transition, working on Osquery, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point to bring up, and all I can really say is that the folks that I worked with on the security team at Facebook really believed in the idea of building trust through securing the systems and trying to ensure that any access to any computer systems are authorized. I mean, certainly, I think we've all learned a lot about Facebook and what the influence of Facebook has been on the world since then. And it's been a while since I've been involved with anything, even close to being on the inside of Facebook.
Do you have a Facebook account today?
I do have a Facebook account. Okay. I don't log on to it much, but the account's there.
You just got 40,000 friend requests.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, how'd you know?
Some of them might be duplicates.
So wait, now at what point, Zach, did you decide to leave and co-found a company based on this open source project that was, funded by Facebook?
Yeah, so essentially what happened was I kind of transitioned all of the work that I was doing at Facebook to head towards Osquery. I just saw the traction that it was gaining. I'd always believed in the open source vision of bringing software to everyone. And as I transitioned towards Osquery, I also kind of was getting a little bit more disillusioned with Facebook, the company, and working in an office like that. And so I ended up leaving and I started consulting. I worked on some early Osquery features for Airbnb that helped them get to their initial Osquery deployment. This is something like 2015, maybe 2016 at that point. And I stayed in touch with Mike Arpaia, who was, like I said, the original visionary for all of this work. And Mike and I got to talking and let's see what we can do to start a company to bring this technology to more folks beyond these kind of early adopters and places where people have like security engineers and software engineers who can get together and build the systems that put everything together in the way that takes you not just from raw capabilities, but to the insights that ultimately everyone's looking for, things that they can take action on. So Mike and I got together with Jason Miller. We founded Collide, which is where we built Collide Fleet, which we open sourced, and that became the nexus for Fleet. Collide ultimately kind of pivoted to some other things that were a little bit less Osquery focused, and I still had that attachment to the open source and the community that was growing around Osquery and growing around Fleet. So I went back to consulting, did that for another couple of years until, come about a year ago, I was approached by Sid C. Brandy, who is actually kind of an auspicious day to mention him. He's the CEO of GitLab. They just went public today.
Oh, that's right.
But yeah, so an exciting day for Sid and that team. Sid kind of pioneered this open core business model, this all remote teams idea. Like you can really build a multi-billion-dollar company that makes a huge impact doing these things. And Sid said, I love this work that you're doing with Osquery and with Fleet. Why don't we try to build a company around it? So that's about exactly a year ago where we went, we're going to really invest further into building up a team and a product and a vision around what's the traction that we built with Fleet as kind of the de facto way to deploy Osquery on a full open source stack.
I see. So Collide is still kind of doing their thing, but you're also doing your thing, and you can do that because it's all open source.
Yeah, I mean, that's the amazing thing about open source, right? Like you can move from organization to organization, and these licenses are designed such that, the MIT license is like such an amazing thing in my opinion. Like anyone can take this software and build whatever they want with it, and that means that we can all benefit from the innovations of others, and we can all pursue the commercial endeavors that we're interested in.
Now, were you involved with like helping to go get funding for the company that you work for today?
Yeah, so we actually we had the great privilege, at least at the start, of getting the funding directly from Sid. Like I was mentioning, he believes in this business model, and so that's what got our foothold into being able to build out a team and stuff.
Yeah, because I can imagine some semi-uncomfortable conversations with potential investors. Be like, so the software is completely free, but we want money to build a company around the software that is out there for free, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's something that people were really skeptical about. And like I said, today it's such an interesting day to have this discussion because we're seeing GitLab, which is this open core. Part of it is truly open source under the MIT license, and part of it is licensed under like their commercial license. And they just IPO'd today at billions of dollars. And I think that it's a testament to the fact that we can both lift up everyone by providing the access to that open core, and we can enable folks to build whatever they want on top of that. And then that also folks and businesses are interested in getting those premium features on top of that and getting the support and just, philosophically supporting the development of this kind of software.
Yeah, I mean, preaching to the choir, I love the freedom that open source gives you, right? That's why I use Linux. It's not because of some religious thing or whatever. I like the freedom to be able to do what I want with my software and my devices. I don't want to be locked into an ecosystem or some piece of software because I have to pay the company for it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also an important part of a pitch for a small company like mine. I mean, we're going to become a pretty critical part of the infrastructure at some fairly large organizations. And the fact that this software is open source means they can audit it themselves and build trust. It means that, we're not going to disappear in the next couple of years. But if we did, they would still have the opportunity to take that code and develop it however they wanted to. So, no one's going to be left in the lurch in this kind of situation.
Do you think that a lot of companies are doing the due diligence and auditing a lot of these open source projects that they're bringing into larger corporations? Or do you think once a project gets to a certain maturity point and the community kind of rallies around it, that the inherent trust kind of takes over?
It's definitely a combination of both. I certainly speak to CISOs and managers in security teams who are saying, like, as part of our procurement process, we're going to do a pen test against Fleet, or we've evaluated the threat model of Osquery. And I mean, I think that Osquery itself at this point, like, it's well known publicly that it's deployed on millions of endpoints across some of the biggest organizations, publicly, like Facebook obviously is using it, but also Google and Apple, and it's just some of these huge organizations are using it. So it sees a lot of scrutiny. And I think that, the combination of those two things means that folks can get to a position of feeling more comfortable than they might be able to feel with, kind of black box closed source software.
And I tell you what, I think one of the reasons why it's so popular with large organizations and they're deploying it to all these systems is because it's kind of addicting. Like, once you get it on one system, you're like, I want this on all my systems. Like, go start it. And that's exactly how it happened here at Security Weekly. I started putting it in a test lab. Then I started putting it in our secondary studio that's more serving as a backup today. And I was like, this is really cool. I'm like, guys, we need to install this on everything, right? It started making its way to be installed on everything because it's so useful.
So,
for sure.
Zach, I've got to ask you this. I mean, software bill of materials, the question you got asked by Tyler, right? Do you support software bill of materials and that whole movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really cool direction that kind of the open source industry, the open source community is pursuing with software. I think it's something that, we have not achieved high levels of purity with the software bill of materials and the reproducible builds and that kind of thing yet with Osquery, and not yet with Fleet, but we've taken steps in those directions. And I think it is going to be really important, especially as we're dealing with the organizations that are the most paranoid about their security, that we can say, everything's open, it's all verifiable, and you can get the artifacts that prove the way that things were built, and you don't have to bootstrap your trust on, like, me, Zach Wasserman. You can bootstrap it on, like, my team verified that this is good, or we verified, based on the signatures of other organizations that we trust, that we're deploying software that's, like, up to the standards that we want to run in our organization.
Zach, could you take us through kind of a high-level architecture? I'm curious, and I haven't done the due diligence to figure out what makes up Fleet and Osquery. Obviously the individual agents, for lack of a better term, running on the systems are going to be operating system dependent, but Fleet also has its architecture. Like, under the hood, like what are the technologies and how are they strung together?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, starting with Osquery, which is, of course, the agent. So it runs on the endpoints, Mac, Linux, Windows. It's all the same code base across each of those. And I think the really interesting idea that is at the heart of Osquery is that it's built directly on SQLite. So it uses the SQLite query planning engine and execution engine to run these queries that you feed it. And you use that SQLite syntax to write queries and access all of these different APIs, hundreds of them. Like, if you go to osquery.io/schema, you can see all of the various tables that are available. But all of these APIs become unified under that interface. And that really enables the analyst or the operator to write queries that come to mind without having to ship new software. Now, Osquery is the agent piece, and it handles things like actually executing the queries, pulling in configurations, running those queries at intervals, generating diffs in the logs so you can look at, like, how things are changing over time, and then also shipping those logs off to various destinations, including doing all these things in communication with a centralized management server. And so that's where Fleet comes in. It becomes this central server for managing Osquery. And with Fleet, you are able to do things like, let me query across all of my 70,000 endpoints that I have connected to Fleet for some indicator of compromise I just became aware of, or who has this application installed because we found out there's a vulnerability in that, or who is using vulnerable kind of configurations. But Fleet doesn't just do that. It also helps to coordinate like the rollout and the management of Osquery at this kind of scale down from, tens of hosts up to hundreds of thousands. But what Fleet does is it stores like some metadata about all of the enrolled hosts in, if you're asking about infrastructure. So, it's a MySQL database and a Redis database that the Fleet server talks to. And then Osquery checks into Fleet and essentially says, what configuration do you want me to run in terms of the schedule of queries? Where do you want me to put the logs that I generate? And do you have any work that you want me to do right now? Mm-hmm. Fleet's able to coordinate all of that. And then Fleet becomes a single pane of glass, if you will, for managing those configurations and for getting the logs into places you need it and for generating insights on top of it. So like an interesting thing that we just added is the ability to collect a software inventory off of any of these endpoints and then to match that up with the vulnerabilities from the National Vulnerability Database.
Wow, that was my feature request for you, Zach, and you read my mind and implemented it already.
That is amazing.
Paul, you got it. You just gotta install Fleet, and I'm telling you, get it up and running in just a few minutes, and that's a free and open source feature in Fleet. So
now, is that an add-on, Zach, that I have to install? Because I forget what you call them now. There's like add-on packages, is that what you call them? That you can, once you get the Fleet up and running, there's a screen where you can add stuff, right?
Yeah, so that's it's not an add-on per se. You have to configure it a small amount within Fleet, but that's built right into the Fleet server. So if you've got Osquery deployed, it's a matter of changing a couple of flags to get Osquery talking to Fleet. And once you do that, you can kind of do everything from Fleet, like configure all the other queries that you want to run or start turning on these kind of useful features.
Gotcha. Yeah, I did it as part of my Security Onion deployment. So.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. And the folks at Security Onion have done an awesome job of kind of packing up Fleet along with a bunch of other really cool open source security tools. And so that's a great way to get started for sure.
Yeah, I'm really digging it. And so, like, to get the vulnerability thing, I need to update or need to install an add-on?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I don't know which version of Fleet Security Onion is shipping, so you may need to update Fleet. If they're shipping a recent enough version, then there's basically just some configs to run. And gotcha. We've got docs on fleetdev.com/docs that you can take a look at for enabling it.
I can bug Doug Burks and be like, hey,
for sure.
Get this in here.
Sam tells us that Doug's coming on the show.
He is. I'll actually be speaking to Doug prior to the show and on the show. So
nice.
Yeah, this is all very timely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that open source is kind of ascendant in the realm of security as people are getting kind of disillusioned with the typical vendor products, and people want to do things where they understand what's going on in the hood, they can integrate more deeply, and they can build trust, again, like on the supply chain kind of things that folks were mentioning. So Security Onion is like a cool example of bringing in all those tools.
So, like, disclaimer, I'm on several Linux Foundation projects. I'm starting a working group under the SPDX project, which just got its ISO certification. Yay! And I'm a big fan of open source. Okay, so but I couldn't agree with you more. I think that people are realizing that open source software allows the integration to be better. Really, closed source software is only really used significantly these days by large enterprise companies with massive legacy deployments, or just the need for, we just want it to cookie cutter it and use it right now and be done with it. Otherwise, how many startups are building on open source cores? If they weren't, Black Duck and other companies like Black Duck and open source tracking companies wouldn't be around, and SBOMs wouldn't be popular. Okay, and that's a good and a bad. I mean, OpenSSL, Heartbleed, yes, I know. But I think, Zach, I'm sorry for rambling on, but I think you're 100% right.
Yeah, and to that point, I think that open source also still has a gap to fill where it's not necessarily as easy to get started with open source because folks haven't invested the time. Usually like your organization gets open source deployed and then you move on from that step. That's something that's like a gap that we really want to try to bridge with Fleet, is let's not just reach the organizations that have highly technical teams who are ready to deploy the software and know what to look for, but let's bring convention over configuration into the picture and always make sure that those highly sophisticated teams can still get at what's under the hood to do anything that their imagination could dream of, which I think is one of the exciting things of working with software that's completely open like that.
Zach, it strikes me that Osquery and Fleet give you this platform where you can ask any question and it will give you an answer. Very similar to actually a commercial, very large commercial company, that accomplishes the same thing. We get all this in open source, which is awesome. But I think in both cases, it begs the question, regardless, if you could ask any question of a system, it's almost overwhelming. Like, wait, what do I want to ask it? Do you have recommendations for like some use cases if people are especially just starting out with Osquery and Fleet?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think that there's a bit of like hierarchy of needs here, where we've got some of the more foundational use cases that people are trying to achieve, like what assets do I have in my organization? What OS versions are they running, and how do we need to prioritize getting those updates in? And that's, of course, information that Osquery can return. You still have to get it deployed, so that's a problem that Osquery doesn't solve. But once you get Osquery deployed, you can find out where do we need to get updates. You can start to address things like who's responsible for these machines and looking at the metadata about the cloud providers that they're living in, and you can get the software inventory and start addressing the vulnerabilities that you're discovering. And then I think another interesting thing that comes into play is if you look at the idea of compliance frameworks. I think someone was mentioning compliance earlier. Like, there's some good ideas there. There's a lot of pain that folks have to go through to get to compliance, but I think there's at the core of it, there's some good ideas of like, let's come up with the best practices that should be applied on our endpoints, and let's try to make sure that they're applied. So, Fleet is also kind of stepping in and introducing the idea of policies, so you can turn asking a question of Osquery into tracking your organizational compliance with your policy, if you will, and that becomes a way for us as Fleet to reach out to our customers and our open source users and say, these are the kind of policies that we recommend that you run, sometimes down to just very basic security hygiene, and sometimes up to, more sophisticated custom use cases that are going to matter on, only individual organization levels. I think that, again, this is where open source shines, because you can understand, if you're an engineer at an organization, you can understand really what capabilities are there, and you can augment the capabilities by shipping your own Osquery extension, or just by going to GitHub and contributing to Osquery directly to get these use cases met that you're looking to achieve.
Yeah, it's a great point, Zach. It's one thing to understand or know what questions to ask. It's another thing to know if an answer is bad or good. So there's some interpretation involved as well.
Yeah, for sure. And some of these things are going to be very clear cut. Like, is the disk encryption enabled on an employee workstation? Like, we can give an accurate yes or no answer to that, and it's clear which way we want that to be configured. But as a security analyst, we might be looking at like, okay, here's a process that's making a connection to an external IP address. I don't really know what's at this IP address, and I don't really know what this process does. Like maybe this is just this employee is getting their job done, or maybe there's something malicious going on. And so there will be challenges in understanding the right ways to ask the questions, and then of course the ways to interpret the answers, like you said.
Is there a monitoring aspect? Like how, let's say I wanted to monitor CPU utilization. Is in that, because that's a question I would have to ask over and over again, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so the way that the monitoring works with Osquery and that would be enabled by Fleet is this scheduled query idea, where you essentially tell Osquery, like, I want you to run a specific query, like tell me all of the processes that are running on the system and how much memory they're using. And I want you to run it every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, hour, once a day, whatever the interval that you want. And then those logs get easily shipped through Osquery and through Fleet into your Splunk or your Elastic or your S3 and Panther, as we're looking at the kind of solutions that folks are moving to. So there is a wide variety of monitoring use cases, both from you're asking about like CPU and memory, that kind of thing, maybe more from an ops perspective, but also monitoring that folks want to do from the more sort of technical security perspective. Like I want to audit all the socket connections that my servers are making and all the processes that execute on those servers, and do file integrity monitoring kind of use cases. So Osquery enables all of those, and you ship the one agent, and then all of a sudden like teams throughout your organization can start getting the insights that they need.
Yeah, it's interesting how querying a system and or monitoring, how much that overlaps with security, because maybe CPU monitoring on its own isn't security related, but when correlated with other events, like there's a new process running that we've never seen before, plus the CPU is spiking, plus there's a lot of disk activity, could be an indication of ransomware, for example.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that something that's still a challenge at a number of organizations is like they just don't have access to the ground truth of what's going on these machines that they manage. And we're talking large and sophisticated organizations. And so I think that this is just a problem of scale. Like when you become a large organization, you have dozens of teams managing endpoints, tens and hundreds of thousands and even millions of endpoints, and getting to the ground truth of what's going on there is a challenge. And Osquery can be a really effective tool for helping to at least ask the questions. And then again, that's where like we're hoping with Fleet to introduce the conventions and more fully integrate these use cases, like asset management and vulnerability management and compliance and that kind of thing.
There are other companies, I know of at least one, that use the technology and are really focused on the security use case. It sounds like something you'd probably support, Zach, right? Like the more people that use the software and benefit, that's a good thing in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'm speaking as, from two roles in some sense. I sit on the Osquery Technical Steering Committee, and as a co-creator of Osquery, I just want to see Osquery succeed and get deployed out to more organizations. And I want to see the future of this kind of monitoring be open source because of what it means for trust and what it means for the people who ultimately use these devices and who are served by the services that run on these servers. So there are a number of organizations, commercial organizations, that are integrating with Osquery. I think it's really cool, actually, to see that and to see how much these big organizations are adopting Osquery, not only for their internal security, but also as part of their product suites.
Sorry, I was trying to think of the name of the company that I was familiar with.
Can I
and make sure
can I ask something,
right.
Paul?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just was talking to a friend of mine, Kat Valentine, actually. She's one of the hosts on Security and Compliance Weekly.
I was going to say, that's lies. You don't have friends.
I have a couple, Larry.
Sorry.
Hey, I count you as a friend, even in the Mankini. So let's not go there, okay?
All right.
Anyway, so I was talking to Kat Valentine. She was one of the first employees at Vanta, and they're an automated compliance and a SOC 2 compliance, and they do a few others. She was telling me that every single automated compliance company that does an agent-based solution to collect information uses Osquery. And so your compliance piece from Fleet, which is obviously based on Osquery, like a lot of people are doing that. Do you feel that you're, and I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question, do you feel you're behind the eight ball on that, or because you're focused on the devices, not necessarily the servers, that you're fine with it?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and it's so interesting that you mentioned Vanta. We actually got together with Vanta and did a little like lunch and learn talk about Osquery recently. If anyone listening is interested, we posted a video online. So like I said, I really endorse everyone using Osquery for all of these commercial purposes. I think Fleet is not focusing on compliance. In particular, the named compliance frameworks as like our central thing right now. We're really focused on device management and getting like authoritative and timely answers to questions that you have about your devices. And I'm hopeful that, again, like the core of Fleet is MIT open source. I'm hopeful that we'll see organizations like Vanta who layer like a really cool layer of both human and technical measures to achieve these compliance frameworks. Will like use Fleet with Osquery as a way to get the data they need to do those jobs. So I wish them the best, and I think there's other organizations like SecureFrame that are using Osquery as part of their
Zach,
automated compliance solutions.
I wanted to make sure we mentioned Optics. Ganesh Pai is the awesome person. They've been on the show in the past, and they're doing some really cool things with Osquery. My question is, and I'm not exactly sure how the MIT license works, quite honestly, because there's so many open source licenses, right? But I guess it's twofold. In the MIT license, if they make modifications, do they have to share them back? The second part is, if commercial companies are doing stuff with Osquery and or Fleet, are they sharing that back with you as well?
Yeah. So the MIT license is really one of those, it's like free as in freedom, but it doesn't have the virality of the GPL license. Mm-hmm. So folks are free to, fork an MIT project and do whatever they want with it. They can contribute the code changes back or not. And Osquery, actually, I believe it's the Apache 2 license, which is very similar. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen, like from Upticks, for example, we've seen some really cool and interesting contributions over the years. And at the same time, like Upticks multiple years ago, I think forked Osquery, and now they kind of have their own like closed source version of Osquery, and that's okay. We embrace anything that they do choose to contribute, and at the same time, I think that there's some challenges that come from trying to maintain some parity with like a fast moving open source project when you've got your own fork and your own changes that you have to layer on top of it.
Zach, you must sleep really well at night, because I love your positive attitude, and you're just embracing that it's out there and people can do whatever they want with it, and you must go to sleep at night and sleep so soundly. I love it. It's a great lesson, because I think many of us will create something and worry about people stealing it, but you don't have those concerns. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, seeing folks like, be happier at work and achieve their jobs and make money with these things and grow the community and the success of all that. Like, I'm just happy to see it.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Because when you think about the polar opposite, right? When we look back into history and early versions of Unix and Microsoft, it's a contentious environment. It's very ugly. Right? This is such a very positive thing for everyone that I wanted to underscore that it doesn't always go down like that, but this is really good to see and a great example.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say, to anyone listening who likes the sound of that, like Osquery's got a super welcoming community. You can join us in the Osquery Slack. Like if you just Google Osquery Slack, there's an open invite. People are super helpful, enthusiastic about Osquery. Like I and my team hang out in the Fleet channel in Osquery Slack, and there's a lot of potential use cases. The community would love to chat, embrace new members, and embrace kind of folks using it for whatever purposes they like.
Some open source projects, Zach, suffer from this syndrome, I guess I'd call it, where you put all this work in, create this software, you give it away for free, and rather than getting contributions back, you just get not even pull requests, you just get tickets that are like, hey, can you add this feature? Hey, can you do this?
Oh, yes.
What's it like in Osquery and more specifically Fleet in that sense? Do you get a lot of contributions back from the community?
Yeah, I would say in both projects we do get a lot, and then both of these projects have this reality where the user of the software tends to be fairly technical, but they tend not to be software engineers. Usually it's someone with a title like security engineer or security analyst or client platform engineer on the more IT kind of side of the house. So we get an interesting mix of folks who are like, oh, I have an idea, like, here's the pull request, I'm ready with the code, like, let's talk about it and get it merged. And folks who are like, here's my idea, but I don't know how to build this. Like, Osquery is written in C++. It ain't easy.
Right, certainly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure, but that's awesome that the folks that have the ideas are sharing it with you and, trying to contribute back in their own way. I think that's important as well. And, when you mentioned the Slack channel too, I think a lot of us might be hesitant to share our ideas and or ask a question because we don't want to seem stupid, right? And I got to imagine your community is not like that at all. Like it's probably very open and very welcoming. If someone asks what would seem like be labeled as a stupid question, it's not in your Slack channel, I would imagine.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely try to promote like good vibes, man. But really, it's like people come with questions sometimes that indicate they don't really understand how the project works, and we try to point them to the resources that they need to understand what it does and point them to the right parts of the manual. And we're not necessarily going to handhold you through everything, especially if it's well documented already, but
right.
We'll treat you with respect for sure.
There's a polite way to say RTFM, right? I get it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had this rule, and it's interesting. I appeared on the Social Engineering podcast with Chris Hadnaghi, and we were talking about my past and jobs and, how the different approaches to learning. And one of them was like at one of my jobs, you had to go research something for at least 30 minutes and try and figure it out on your own. Then when you go to ask someone who's more senior than you a question, their first question back to you was kind of implied, like, what did you do to figure it out on your own? And if you show that you were putting some effort in, then they would help you, right? And that's a thing. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to Osquery and Fleet and a lot of these things we implement too, but you got to put your work in first.
I buy that entirely. And I think that putting that kind of work in before asking a question helps us learn things and build up a foundation of knowledge that is a really worthwhile investment. So that's the kind of thing that we encourage with our team internally at Fleet with our engineers. Like, you have a question about something, maybe your first instinct shouldn't be to ask. Maybe your first instinct should be think about it a little bit, look, see what you can learn, and then ask. Don't spend your whole day
right.
trying to figure out what's going on. But remember that those minutes that you spend thinking and spinning your wheels on this are a good investment.
Absolutely. No, it's a great way to think of it. More questions for Zach?
I got to play with awesome. That's what it is.
You definitely do. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, it really is addicting when you get started with it. You just want to deploy it everywhere. Oh, and that was my other question too, was do you plan to support IoT-based devices? Many of them are Linux-based, but I certainly understand the challenges of creating, software for IoT devices, but it would be super handy to have some of this telemetry from those devices.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some really interesting emerging use cases. And for example, we just saw some cool work from the community adding support for building Osquery for ARM. I think it was primarily motivated by like the new AWS Graviton or Gravitron instances, but like Osquery is building and running on ARM64. I think that getting to new platforms is probably going to be something that we'll see over the coming time, and addressing, emerging things like more ephemeral infrastructure, containers, like getting into things like eBPF and all of that. Like there's a ton of interesting directions to take this, and the model of applying SQL as the abstraction to these things has been really successful. So definitely excited to kind of help work with the community on envisioning and then bringing to life these new use cases.
So I had one follow-up, and that was, are any of those use cases you're looking at, things you've been asked about, just too grandiose, they'd be awesome, cool, but you can't figure out how you could ever pull it off?
The biggest thing that comes to mind for me is like iOS. Like people want some instrumentation on iOS. Sorry, what was that?
I said that would be cool.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is though, like the APIs that are available are pretty limited by design. So it's like thinking about what we're gonna do there. Like, are we gonna is Osquery gonna jailbreak the device to get to the information that we want? Like, it's probably not the best idea, but like there's some interesting challenges there. Like, how do we operate in environments where the information is intentionally constrained and yet the threats are real?
I like that iOS is more of a challenge than BPF. BPF is very complex, but at least it's open. Right? There's an answer somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I'm not going to claim that I know how to do BPF programming, but like Alessandro Gario over at Trail of Bits has been doing some really awesome work with eBPF and Osquery, and
that's cool.
Now you can get process and socket events through eBPF and Osquery.
It's pretty awesome. Zach, I just have 5 questions for you. They're 5 silly questions that we ask of all of our new guests here on Security Weekly. So you're ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Let's do it.
3 words to describe yourself.
Like a zebra.
If you were to write a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Just chill.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Towel.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Oh man, I don't watch that many movies. It's like, am I a bad hacker for not even having one?
No, certainly not.
No, honestly, you're probably a better hacker for not.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
So we'll take that as your homework. War games, sneakers, hackers. Some of those.
Swordfish.
Yeah, someone throw me a recommendation here.
The Matrix.
The Matrix. The net.
Oh yeah.
Net, but not the net.
I've seen The Matrix. I love that one.
There you go.
Score.
Squid Game.
Zach,
not a hacker movie.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Thanks, Lee. I was waiting for you to do it.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting one. Let's say oh man, I'm just, the pop culture things really throw me off here.
Doesn't have to be pop culture. I mean, like 1920s authors and book characters are completely valid.
Completely valid.
Oh yeah. So how about Tom Robbins actually as an author? I think just such a Sweet. Wild and creative imagination that seems pretty interesting. And then let's say Trey Anastasio, guitar player from Phish. Not sure if anyone likes
nice.
that.
Yeah, no, I'm actually a big Phish fan.
Didn't trip you up at all.
There you go. Outstanding. Zach, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Paul, and everyone.
Thanks, Zach.
Coming up next, Sven Morgenroth from NetSparker will come on and talk about GraphQL and hacking it. Stay tuned.